News. What's up, nerds? It's your boy, the OGGM, coming to you live. 9:33 in the morning here on the 11th day of September 2023. May we never forget. God, love and help our support our friends in New York who are still recovering from this horrible day. Yeah, got nothing to say on that one. Wandering Monsters. So last week we talked about random tables and how a lot of systems lately are relying heavier on random tables than you might think. In fact, there's at least one role-playing game coming out, if not more, in the next year or so that seem to be having random tables as a intricate mechanic of the game as opposed to a helpful tool on the side. And which begs the question, why is this seem to be a trend? And when does it become relying too heavily on the randomness? Now, random tables are a great tool, especially if you're not prepared and you got to run a game tomorrow and you're like, oh, crap. You pull out the random tables, you make a real quick thing, and then you run with it. So behind the scenes, random tables are great. But at the table, random great tables can bog things down because you're constantly looking at it and checking and cross-referencing and, goes to subtable 3 and blah, blah, blah. And that can bog down a normal game. Now imagine a game where the random tables are in the forefront and a huge chunk of the game is built upon just randomly throwing stuff at player characters. I don't know if that's a good thing. It doesn't feel like it is. It feels like it's a huge time waste and can lead to some very nonsensical things, which of course got me thinking about random monsters. Now, random monsters as a DM is one of your best tools because it's a great way to keep things going, move things along, and get the energy back flowing when things start bogging down. Logistically, there should be at least one or two things wandering around in this huge underground megapolis, even if they're just my beloved slime, and maybe an occasional undead. Not mentioning the possible employees of said underground megapolis. So having wandering monsters isn't, and it never has been, a bad thing. It's one of the best tools you could have. Oh no, they made a noise. Wandering monster check. Oh no, so-and-so wandered off on his own. Wandering monster check, right? You don't want to become too highly dependent upon them, but they do show that the dungeon is a living, breathing, evolving place, and that there are individual things that live down there, whether they be the employees of the dungeon or just happenstances because the dungeon is there. Slimes, of course, being my favorite wandering monster because you never have to explain them. And we've gone off on slimes before, and we will again in the future. So I have some of the example wandering monster tables and from the old days, from the classic DM's guide. And they're strange. Now, you would think when you're down in the underground megapolis that you're going to encounter things that would be sensical to be down there, like running into slime. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Running into insects. Sure, that makes sense. You find insects crawling around underground, right? Giant versions of the insects. Well, that's a little more ridiculous, but it is just an accepted trope of the genre that if there's going to be centipedes, for some reason, there's giant kaiju centipedes because 1950s science fiction is one of the heavy influences of the game. So, of course, OG kaiju, giant reptile attacking the city, giant spider, whatever, inspired some of the wandering monsters. So, yeah, a few humanoids. Sure, that makes sense, of course. Also, I'm in a dungeon built by a necromancer. I'm going to run into necromancer things. I'm in a dungeon built by evil guy. Evil guy is going to employ some orcs and stuff. So sure, I can understand those things wandering around. Where do they stay? So you never have to explain slime. You never have to explain insects. You never have to explain undead. They don't need a place to stay. They don't need food. They don't need a bathroom. But then once you start introducing humanoid monsters, you got to explain where they came from and what they're doing on their time off. And then you get to the weirder stuff. You look at some of the tables from the old days and you're like, yeah. Like the tables, especially ones that involved humanoids, listed superheroes as one of the things you could run into a dungeon And harlots, ladies of the night, is another thing you could possibly run into in a dungeon or in the city. Now, you got to remember, 1976, 1977, 1978, I'm rolling on random monster tables. One of the things I think is superheroes. The first thing that goes through your brain is, what is Spider-Man doing in my dungeon? What are you referring to? Superheroes. Now, your mind doesn't instinctively go, oh, he's referring to high-level fighters, because superhero is one of the level names for fighters. So what it's really meaning is you run into 1d4 medium to high-level fighters, because back then levels had names, and one of the levels' names was superhero, which then goes back to the 7-year-old in you going, so when my character levels, he becomes Spider-Man. Why is superhero on the table? Right? Orc, goblin, slime, skeleton, superhero. And harlots. Why harlots? Well, because harlots were supposed to be things you ran into in the city at night, but for some reason, somehow they also ended up on some of the ones. So here's in my hand is my copy of the old DM's guide, Advanced D&D, the classic. Here's the first level thing of random monsters you might encounter in a dungeon. Giant ape. Why is there a giant ape in this underground cavern? Servant slave for the guy who made the place? Okay. Badger. All right, fine. Beetle. Okay, fine. Demon. First level. Why is there a demon here? That makes no sense. Is the demon employed here? Was he summoned by the wizard? Why is there a demon just wandering around the tunnels? It's normally something you would see guarding something, but okay. Dwarf. Definitely see a dwarf. Ear seeker. What is that? It's some kind of giant insect, right? What? I don't know. Elf. One lone elf wandering around in the dungeon? Is he an escaped prisoner? Gnome. Goblin. Definitely goblins. I mean, goblins should pretty much just be the only thing you run into in a first level of dungeon. They're the main employees of the dungeon. Hobgoblin. Human. We got this human subtable, and that's where we get superhero and harlot. Kobold, orc, piercer, Ryan jet, giant rat, rock grub, shrieker, skeleton, and zombies. So most of the things on here, right, make sense. Those are all things you would run into a dungeon. Then, of course, your giant ape and demon and an elf, and you're like, why are they here? Much less superhero and harlot. So wandering monsters should know what they're doing. They should be a useful side tool. Ahead of time, you can just roll on the randoming monster table to help generate a quick adventure. During the game, while they're adventuring, if something happens or if they're slowing down, you throw some wandering monsters at them to get things going. But you want the wandering monsters to make sense. The wandering monsters should know what they're doing. If I'm in the lost caves of the necromancer Steve the Cat, the wandering monsters should be mostly undead, right? I'm a necromancer. I don't want to employ humanoids or goblins or whatever. They cause trouble. They break things. I have to pay them. I'll just animate some skeletons. So much easier, right? If I'm in the abandoned labs of Steve the Mad Alchemist, well, then I would expect to run into slimes and stuff like that and alchemical things. If I'm just in underground cave system, then my wandering monster should be underground cave system specific. Insects, slimes, maybe a dwarf or two. I should definitely not be running into giant ants or superheroes or apes or things that don't fit the dungeon. And if I'm going to include humanoids like goblins, well, then the goblins need some place to stay. And they need a food source. And they need a storage and where they go to the potty. And then I need to explain why I'm employing these goblins and orcs. How do they fit into the story of the dungeon? As opposed to a ape, which I don't know why there's an ape in my dungeon. A arboreal jungle-based simian that lives off fruits and insects is in this underground cave. Not sure how it got here, but okay. So I guess since we're talking about random being a major tool in the forefront of the system. You want the random tables to make sense, and you want the random tables not to be a crutch. And that's my problem with a lot of these games that are coming out that are random forward. Like this, just hit the ground, start rolling random. You don't need to prep. It's like, yeah, you kind of need to prep. Even if you're rolling random, you need to prep that the random monsters and the random encounters make sense. What I run into a city that's by the ocean would be completely different than what I run into at a city in the desert. And what I run into an abandoned gold mine would be completely different than what I run into in a necropolis or a wizard's lair. So you don't want to be random in the centric, because the random tables might not make sense. And instead of facilitating the story to moving forward, you're suddenly bogging down, because suddenly you're trying to explain, why is there a dungeon ape in this dungeon? I don't know. Why? Where did that come from? I don't think random tables should be a centric mechanic. They should be something that is a useful tool that you look at occasionally when you're at loss. And especially with random monsters, the only time the random monsters would show up should be either 1, when they made a noise, 2, whenever somebody's dumb enough to go wander off on their own because it's what my character would do, or more importantly, it is the tool you as the DM could use to keep them moving. If things start bogging down, if it looks like they're losing interest, if suddenly the phones are out and they're joking amongst themselves and they're not really paying attention, you just, roll the sound of those rolling dice. And then you're like, okay, you guys hear? Yeah, that just gets them moving. Oh, we've got some things. That's really nice to have people responding these days. Thanks for responding, people, except for this guy, this Mar Hockman guy. No, not that guy. But Crab Phone, Crab Phone, you can respond. This guy's okay. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on random tables? What are your thoughts on wandering monster tables? What are your thoughts on having wandering monsters tables be more sensical as opposed to just randomly running into an ape and a superhero in a dungeon and then going, why is Spider-Man in the dungeon? Which I guess really is the final question of this. Why are superheroes? Why am I running into Spider-Man? Did you know that's how superhero role-playing games started? The very first superhero role-playing game ever. The story goes that somebody randomly rolled and superhero came up, and like me, the first thing they thought of was Spider-Man, and somebody else supposedly said, I want to place the Flash in the dungeon. And that is supposedly the very first kernel of the very first superhero role-playing game. Now, I don't know if that's 100% true, but it sure does sound like it. Because I know 7-year-old me saw superheroes on the list, and the first thing I'm thinking is, why is Batman in my dungeon? So I can't be the only one who thought that, right? So, yeah. Now, I don't know if that story true, but it's an interesting bit of trivia. Anyways, that's all I got to say on this topic. Back to the news. I'm the OGGM. If you appreciate the nonsense that's coming out of my mouth, you know what to do. Subscribe. Till then, have a great day. Stay off my land.